Hello everyone. Good morning or afternoon or evening, whatever it may be. My name is Noam Amir and I will be presenting the paper Do Musicians Speak Differently? Preliminary Results of a Production Study. Question. Are musicians different from other people in their various capabilities? So many studies have examined the perceptual capabilities of musicians related to many different aspects. For instance, frequency sensitivity, that is sensitivity to pitch, to precision in musical tones, their sensitivity to intensity, to timing, that is in rhythm and so forth, and spectral sensitivity, that is their sensitivity to changes in timbre, for example. There are been many different type of tests to examine this. Some of them are purely psychoacoustics, where there is no musical context. Subject here various beeps, and I have to answer various questions. The tones are usually non-musical, signs or similar. And some tests are musical, hearing musical tones within a context. For instance, hearing a short piece where one of the tones is incorrect to various degree, and the tones used in such tests are maybe natural or maybe synthetic, but they do resemble musical instruments or even singing. Many such studies have been conducted, and musicians have been shown quite often to have more sensitive hearing than laymen. There have been differences found within musician groups related to which instrument they played. For instance, is it instrument in which they control the pitch, as in a string bowed instrument, or not? The type of music they normally play, classical or not, often has been a point of comparison, and of course their experience in playing music. Some paradigms also examined carryover from one obvious skill to a less obvious one. For example, musicians which are not singing were examined to see if their productions were more precise than non-musicians when they had to replicate a tone they heard. And some studies even went one step further, to see if musicians, which shown to be sensitive to musical stimuli, were also more sensitive to linguistic stimuli, for instance, present in tone languages, through perception of tones or meaning of tones. One thing that, to our best knowledge, has not been examined at all is whether musicians are different in production of so-called regular speech, where the productions they are asked to create are not related to any musical task. In essence, do they speak in some way that is different from laymen? In our labs, we've been examining various capabilities of musicians versus non-musicians for several decades, and in a recent test, we administered quite a large battery of tests to a group of musicians and non-musicians, and one of these tests was production of narrow focus. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term narrow focus, but just to make sure, to review it in one slide. Focus is very well known and often studied pragmatic aspect of speech prosody, wherein one word in a sentence is emphasized to convey its additional relative importance. There are many different paradigms for eliciting narrow focus and for evaluating narrow focus, and many previous studies have addressed both production and perception of narrow and contrastive focus. Contrastive focus is very close to narrow focus. You can find there's not maybe totally widespread accepted definition of contrastive and narrow, but you can find that in the literature. So in this study, we set out to address several questions. Our main question was, do musicians produce, when speaking, do they produce narrow focus that is in any way different from productions by non-musicians? Some extra questions. Does extensive training in speech and hearing, not as musicians, but as a speech and hearing clinician, would that influence the perception of narrow focus? And is the perception of narrow focus different when it is present in different word locations in an utterance? So, what are the methods we employed here? Our speakers were two groups of native Hebrew speakers. One is a group of musicians, 5 males, 3 males, young, all professional in playing classical music, and a group of native Hebrew speakers, non-musicians, again matched in age, more or less in general education. None of them played music for more than 6 months, do not engage in music regularly, and all speakers went a hearing screening test demonstrating normal hearing thresholds. Our listeners were again two groups, native Hebrew speakers. The experienced listeners were students, fourth year undergraduate students in communication disorders. Such students with already quite a body of formal and practical training, both in phonetics and phonology. We assumed they would be more sensitive to finer differences in speech production. And our inexperienced listeners were also matched by age and education, but not students of communication disorders. None of them had any known hearing problems or musical background. So, in recording, we had 6 forward sentences of the form subject, verb, object, and adjective. 4 contrastive questions were composed for each such sentence, intended to elicit contrastive focus separately on each of the 4 words of the sentence. So overall, each speaker produced 24 utterances. We see here several examples of our sentences. In English, they have more than 4 words. In Hebrew, of course, they're 4-word sentences. And 2 examples. One is following.
הילד ראה סרט מצויר.
So we can hear a focus on the 3rd word. This is a non-musician.
הילד ראה סרט מצויר.
I think the contrastive focus is quite apparent there, but one of our musicians produced an utterance like this. Sorry.
האריה ראה זבוב גדול.
We can hear a very clear contrastive focus on the 2nd word, and very, very pronounced. Now, of course, these are very maybe not typical productions, but you can get the idea. So overall, we had 384 recordings. We had some technical issues with some of them, so we retained 366. So, concerning the perceptual tests, we had custom-written software in MATLAB. You can see a screenshot on below right. Played all these 366 recordings in random order, and we asked a very direct question of the listeners. Is one of the words in the sentence emphasized? Please say which one. If one of the words was selected, we also had a follow-up questions to rate the level of emphasis on a scale of 1 to 5. Of course, there was also the possibility of stating that no word was emphasized. So, all of our 20 listeners heard all of these 366 recordings. To score all of these recordings, we performed averages over the 10 non-experienced listeners and the 10 experienced listeners. And we derived 2 variables. One was correct identification. We counted the number of times the correct word that we expected to be emphasized was identified as the emphasized one. and the maximum possible score was 10 because there are 10 listeners per group. There were no broad focus presentations, so there was a word expected to be emphasized in all of the stimuli presented. And then a second variable was the intensity, averaging the intensity scores, but only when the correct word was judged as emphasized. When no emphasis was found, the intensity was, of course, counted as 0. So this gave us the scoring upon which we performed the statistical analysis. So let's look at the results. This screen shows two graphs denoting the identification, the first variable we calculated, the correct identification of the emphasized word. On the left, we have a graph for the experienced listeners, and on the right, we have a graph for the inexperienced listeners. We have two bars in each case. The blue bar represents judgments of musician speech. The red marks judgments of non-musician speech. And on the bottom of each graph, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the word positions. So we can see several general trends that appear quite clear in these graphs. First, we see that towards the end of the utterance, as the emphasized word is towards the end of the utterance, it is identified less as emphasized. We can see here the y-axis is percent of correct identifications. There's almost a ceiling effect on the first two words, less so on the third, and even less on the fourth. This is true for both experienced listeners and inexperienced listeners. Also, we see that the blue bar always seems to be higher. In all these cases, the blue bar is always higher. That is, musician speech seems to be judged to be more emphasized than non-musician speech, but we have yet to see if this is significant. And a careful examination will show that generally the bars here on the left are slightly higher than the bars on the right. So it seems that experienced listeners have judged emphasis in general more correctly than inexperienced listeners. We carried out statistical analysis to determine whether all these observations are significant or not. The details are present in the paper, but generally we can state the following. There is a significant main effect for listening group. That is, the experienced listeners here on the left judged emphasis more correctly than the inexperienced listeners. The differences were not enormous, but they are significant. Second, the trend for lower identification towards the end of the utterance was also found to be significant. Generally, this can be represented as a quadratic line. However, despite the fact that the blue bars are always higher, there was no main effect for speaker groups. So even though there is a tendency for musicians to be judged as emphasizing more, this was not found to be significant. We did the same analysis on the second variable, the intensity of emphasis. The overall observations seen before are quite well repeated here. Remember, the scale was a scale between 0 to 5 for intensity. We see that generally there is a trend for the musician's speech emphasis to be judged as more intense. The blue bars are always higher than the red ones. We can see that all the bars on the left are slightly higher, maybe more pronounced than previously, than the bars on the right, meaning that experienced listeners judge the intensity higher than inexperienced listeners, and we can see the trend of reduced intensity of emphasis towards the end of the utterances. The analysis, the statistical analysis, replicated the previous one almost exactly, meaning that the difference between listening groups was significant. The trend to lower emphasis towards the end of the utterance was significant. However, again, despite the fact that the blue bars are always higher, the difference between musicians' speech and non-musician speech was not found to be significant. So let's discuss this a bit. Taking our research questions again from the last to first, is production, or is there a difference in judgment of narrow focus in different word locations in an utterance? Yes. It's hard to say at this stage whether it's a question of perception or production. I tend to think that it is production and not perception, but this should be determined. We have to think of how to do that. Question 2. Does extensive training in speech and hearing, not as musicians, does that influence perception of narrow focus? Yes. Our fourth-year students of communication disorders were more sensitive to emphasis and achieved higher scores both in percent correct and in judging the intensity of emphasis. However, our main research questions, do musicians produce narrow focus perceptually different from non-musicians? Well, I leave it here with a question mark. The difference was not statistically significant, but again was very, very consistent. In all the graphs previously, the blue bars were always higher than the red ones. It was not significant. We have to remember our sample size was quite small. We had 8 musicians, 8 non-musicians. So we are in the process of extending this study to 8 more musicians and non-musicians, and hopefully that will bring the results to the difference to significance. Some conclusions. It's interesting to note that experienced listeners, their manner of listening and somehow is influenced by their training. This is an interesting point, and it's encouraging as educators of speech clinicians that our training gives them some kind of added sensitivity, which they will probably use in their professional life. We found stronger emphasis at the beginning, middle of utterances than at the end. This is interesting, and we intend to look at it further. And as I said, musicians were not conclusively found to produce focus differently, but the trend was quite consistent, and we are very interested in this, especially in view of the fact that this is an issue that has, again, to the best of our knowledge, not been studied at all. In future work, we will definitely increase the sample size of speakers. We will examine perception through an indirect question rather than a direct one. And of course, we plan to do acoustic analysis on all the recordings. Thank you very much, and I hope to meet you in future conferences, actually in person and not in this rather strange way. Thank you very much.